Hello and welcome to the Baywatch podcast, where I try to watch every episode of the 80s/90s hit show Baywatch. Let's get started. Forever and always, I'll always you. Alright guys, today we're going to be discussing Season 1, Episodes 11 and 12. But before we get started, I know that I have not posted an episode for 2 months. But in the month of October, I like to watch a lot of horror movies, and I've discovered other shows, if you can tell from my episodes of I Just Watched. But, as I said from the very beginning, I am committed to doing this, and I have an exciting announcement. I have finally done it. I have finally purchased the complete series of Murder, She Wrote, which is one of my all-time favorite shows, and I'm going to do a podcast on that too, because I have never seen every single episode of Murder, She Wrote, which I love. Angela Lansbury, and I love that show. So, in addition to this, I'm going to be doing that too. And I swear I am going to get to when Baywatch starts being good. As of this recording, I want to say Happy Veterans Day to all who have served. If any of you are listening, thank you for your service. And also, if I didn't say it before, also happy belated Memorial Day. And I believe I said it in my episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? But since this is a separate podcast from that, happy belated Halloween. Alright, now that we've got all that out of the way, let's dive into Season 1, Episode 11, The Reunion. Air date, December 15th, 1989. This is the last episode that aired in 1989 of Baywatch. And coincidentally, on this same exact day, the fantastic movie that I just had the awesome privilege of watching tonight on Turner Classic Movies, called Glory, starring Matthew Broderick, Morgan Freeman, and Denzel Washington, about the Civil War, is a fantastic movie, and it was released on that day. Limited release. It didn't get a wide release until, I think, January of 1990. But it's a fantastic film that if you like the Civil War and is fascinated with it like I am, it's a very interesting film to see. Denzel Washington got an Academy Award for that, and Matthew Broderick, in my opinion, should have too, because he was really good. And so was Morgan Freeman. The number one movie at the box office, to paint you a picture, around this time in 1989 was War of the Roses, which everyone says I should watch, but I have not, and I want to so badly. But maybe someday I will. And about, I want to say, 2 or 3 weeks later after this episode air date, yours truly was born on December 27th, 1989. So I will be 30 years old this year. Oh boy. Sometimes I am happy about it, other times I'm not. But it's life, so. But anyway, just little trivia facts I decided to throw in for your listening pleasure. Anyway, let's get into this episode. We start with a random montage that does not make any sense whatsoever. It's out of focus, it's hard to tell what's going on, but we get to see Newbie, Michael Newman, the actual real lifeguard in real life that pitched Baywatch as a show. So it's nice to see him ever so often. And after this random montage, we dissolve to Deathglare, aka Craig, and Mitch practicing for a rowboating competition that they apparently decided to enter in together, and are having a reunion of sorts with their old surfer buddies or something. And one of those surfer buddies just so happens to be a woman named Allison, whom Craig dated and Mitch dated. And Allison is played by Dana Sparks, who would go on to be on the hit NBC soap opera Passions. She played the role of Grace Bennett and her twin sister Hope, who she never gets to meet. And if you're wondering why, you'll just have to find episodes on YouTube, but I warn you that Passions draws things out for long periods of time. But it was a really good soap, and I enjoyed it when I was a kid. Anyway, the story goes that Craig wanted to leave Florida, Los Angeles, to study to be a lawyer in New York. And apparently he broke up with Allison and told Mitch to keep an eye on her when he went to New York, and somehow, some way, her and Mitch ended up dating while Craig was away. And eventually, at some point, because they say it's 12 years, it's been 12 years since they saw her, and Hobie is supposed to be 12 years old. So somewhere in between there, Mitch met Hobie's mother, they had Hobie, got married, and I guess, I don't know, the timeline is a little muffled, but this is Baywatch, we're not going to overanalyze it. We might get a headache if we do. So, of course, Deathglare, aka Craig, is just brooding over this, and Gina is conveniently not in this episode because I guess it would seem like Craig is more of a jackass if his wife was actually still there while he was trying to fight over this woman. And as Eddie points out in a later scene, everything worked out with you and Gina. What is your problem? What does it matter if Mitch is with Allison at all? And you know that things have taken a turn when Eddie is the one that's making sense. But don't worry, guys. Eddie is the dumbest guy in this whole entire episode. So we then get introduced to a lifeguard that the show swears up and down to you that has always been there. And I think his name is Tony. No, Paul. His name is Paul. We'll go with that. Okay. And they try to swear up and down that Paul has always been there, and, there's no question. And him and Eddie seem to be best friends. Eddie complains to him that he needs a car to impress Shawnee, because remember, they're dating now, and they spot a good-looking woman and a Porsche. And Paul goes, "Wow, isn't that great?" And Eddie goes, "The woman or the car?" And he goes, "Both." And Eddie goes, "Oh yeah, of course, yeah, both, yeah, right, uh-huh." And later that night, after he sees the car, after Paul sees the car, he tips off another lifeguard whose name I don't know, and neither does IMDb, who steals the car right in broad daylight for everyone to see. He doesn't have the keys, so he sticks like a thing in there that makes the lock come up, you know how car thieves do, and steals it. And the extras are watching him do this. It's so hilariously stupid. Anyway, later that night, Paul presents the Porsche to Eddie, and even though Eddie saw it earlier, doesn't put two and two together, and then Paul says to him, $200 and she's yours. And it's like, $200 for a car like that. Of course, Eddie is stupid enough to be like, "Oh, yes," and gives him the $200 without any question. See, told you guys, the dumbest. Meanwhile, at Mitch's house, he's having a party with his surfer buddies, and for Allison on movie nights, the Allison in real life who does a review series on Baywatch, did this episode, and during the party scene there's like a lot of music blasting and you can't really hear what they're talking about. So if you always wondered that, Allison, if you're listening, which I don't think she is, they're basically telling a weird story of where Allison in the show had to save Mitch from getting eaten by a shark or something. It's a really confusing story, and Hobie comes over and says, I'm going to tell my children, your grandchildren, those stories. They'll laugh at you, or something to that effect. It's a really weird scene. And eventually, Mitch and Allison get reacquainted, and of course, as tradition of the show, they have sex in front of the fireplace after everybody leaves. And honestly, I don't understand why people have sex in front of a fireplace. I mean, you would think that it would make you really, really hot. I mean, you get hot when you're having sex anyway, but I mean, you'd be even more hot. But what do I know? So, cue montage of Eddie and Shawnee washing Eddie's new car and having fun, fun, fun. Eventually, Eddie brags to Trevor, look at my car, it's so cool, I love it so much. And Trevor asks him how much he got for it, and had to pay for it, and he's like, only $200. And Trevor's like, I don't think that you would pay that much for a car like this. And Eddie's like, well, I didn't think you guys down under knew anything about cars. All you know is about kangaroos and koalas. It's like, did I miss something? When is it that every time Eddie and Trevor are together, Eddie insults him because he happens to be from Australia? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. But Trevor opens the hood and looks in and notices that the serial number has been scratched off, and he goes, well, mate, that car's been stolen. And instead of going to the police like a rational human being would, Eddie strolls into the locker room, grabs Paul by the neck, throws him up against the locker and says, you gave me a stolen car, I want my money back. And I want you to take it back to whoever you got it from. And Jill comes in and goes, is there a problem here? And they go, no, just a friendly discussion. And then she goes, okay, and walks away. And that is pretty much her whole purpose in this episode. So, instead of, I don't know, doing the logical thing and just giving him his money back and not explaining anything, for some reason this guy decides to give Eddie his money back and then give him a job in the car theft ring. Because he says, we don't make enough money as lifeguards, so you might as well do this, too. And don't tell anybody. So it looks like Eddie's about to go along with it. Meanwhile, Mitch and Allison are in full swing and kissing and making out in front of Death Glare, aka Craig, who, trivia fact, also starred in Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys' Mystery Hour in the late 1970s, and his eyes were as creepy in that show as they are in this one. Anyway, just trivia fact I thought you'd like to know. Anyway, Mitch comes over and Craig's all upset because he was supposed to come and practice the rowing boat competition, and they start fighting, and Craig is like, you never paid me back for the money I gave you for that car. And Mitch is like, I got the receipts, I got records, I can prove to you that I paid you back for that car, and this, that, and the other. And it's a really weird fight. So Mitch spends the rest of that afternoon going through his receipts to basically prove that he paid Craig back. Allison comes and Mitch explains to her what's going on, and she's like, I don't want to come between you and your friendship. So she goes away from them and refuses to be a part of it. Meanwhile, Eddie is now part of the car stealing ring, and A woman comes with a car, drops the keys under a towel, and then walks away. Eddie drops his life preserver thing and picks them up, gives them to the unnamed lifeguard that's in on it, who goes and opens the car and starts driving away. But it turns out that Eddie has involved all the lifeguards, Mitch, Craig, Jill, and of course our resident lifeguard cop, Goner. But of course Paul ends up figuring it out and knocking Eddie out cold with the life preserver thing they carry around. And the other guy doesn't get off scot-free. You know the little parking dividers that they put up so that you can't enter a parking lot after dark? Well, for some reason, Goner decides to swing that towards the car thief coming towards him, and it barely misses him when it goes to the windshield. And it reminded me of that scene in Final Destination where the log falls off the truck and goes sailing through the car and decapitates that one guy. So it's like, he's just stole a car, Goner. Why would you try to decapitate the poor man? And for some reason, Paul proves to be a stupid criminal and decides, instead of running away from the ocean and towards the parking lot to get in a car himself and drive away, he decides to run towards the ocean. And Craig and Mitch basically both get him. And he gets arrested. Through the power of getting the criminal, they make up, and they end up winning the rowing competition. Even though there was a montage in between this time where people were rowing, which I thought was the actual competition, but no. And you can tell that the extras are really tired and they're like really trying to be enthusiastic during these scenes, but you can tell they're not. So the episode ends with Craig and Mitch resolving their differences and saying that it all worked out fine because, you know, Craig ended up marrying Gina and he loves her even though she's not in this episode, and presumably doesn't know any of this is going on. And Craig ends up calling Allison off screen, who comes over to Mitch's house and agrees to give it another try, and it's presumed at the end of the episode with the end credits that they're going to get together. But as far as I know, we never see her again. So there's that. And that's the end of that episode. Now let's talk about Season 1, Episode 12. The Armored Car. Air date January 5th, 1990. And this episode is even more problematic than the last one. In this episode, they're trying to save the pier. Now, I don't really know the necessary geography of Baywatch. I don't know how far Mitch's house is from headquarters. I have no idea if this is the pier from the pilot movie or what, but they're trying to save it because apparently it's been up there for years and they're trying to raise money to just fix it, but they don't want to tear it down because they feel it's a national monument. And they think that the best way to do this is to have two women in a bikini, have random people pose with bags of money in an armored car that is sitting on top of the pier. A man is underneath, inspecting the pier, hitting various boards with a hammer, seeing if they're loose and hoping they won't fall, and that's exactly what happens. A bunch of boards fall on top of him, which sends him into the water, and he's knocked out so he can't swim. So Mitch ends up jumping into the water, no lifeguard uniform, jeans and all, into the water to save this guy. But don't worry, he's okay. And in true Jaws fashion, even though this worker got hurt, the mayor basically says that he's fine and that they're going to continue with their fundraiser to save the pier. And my question is, why not just use the money in the armored car to save the pier? Why have people pay money to take pictures with money? That seems really, really stupid. I am serious. So, and yet another Eddie and Shawnee's subplot in this episode, which drives the whole episode, Shawnee is upset because Eddie won't spend any time with her. Consider yourself lucky. He wants to go off on a weekend excursion with the guys and not spend any time with her. So he decides to take her to the carnival that I guess they're having to save the pier. And even though she's playing games and wins a prize, Eddie's not paying any attention to her. He's listening to a sports game. This angers Shawnee, and she's like, you know what, you don't even care about me, so why are we even doing this? And to prove that he cares about her, he goes, let's go take pictures with the money. Just so happens there's a little girl whom is posing with the money, who really doesn't want to pose with the money. And at this moment, the pier decides to shift, causing the girl to get stuck in the armored car. Eddie and Shawnee, who just so happen to be there and just so happen to be lifeguards, decide to save her. Eddie ends up crawling through but can't reach her, so he has Shawnee crawl on top of him. The girl then uses their legs as a way to get out, and as soon as she gets out, the armored car ends up plunging over the pier into the water below, trapping Shawnee and Eddie inside. Meanwhile, Jill, we get an interesting backstory on Jill. Jill used to be a volleyball player, and apparently her ex-husband used to be one too. And to show him up, she decides to enter into a volleyball tournament that just so happens to be happening somewhere around Baywatch, and she enlists Trevor to be her partner. And you know Baywatch and their lovely pacing, they keep cutting back and forth between the armored car and the volleyball tournament. But basically, Shawnee and Eddie get trapped in the armored car. They're basically sitting in there, and Eddie realizes he should spend more time with Shawnee. Shawnee's trying to keep his head above water because he's stuck by a rowing cart that had money in it, which the money is completely useless now because it's all wet. Mitch and company use balloons to raise the car, but they have to wait for about 24 hours before they can open it because it has to have a certain code so that no one would steal the money. Jill wins the volleyball tournament despite her arm being pulled or something. And Shawnee and Eddie eventually get out of the armored car, and all is well and right with the world of Baywatch. I mean, if you ever wondered, and that's the episode, if you ever wondered about, why did this show not succeed? These two episodes are kind of a big, huge example of that. I mean, they are kind of they are weird. And not all that great. But also kind of funny. How Shawnee and Eddie get stuck in that armored car and how it's slowly filling up with water. And then we get pacing back and forth, a montage with weird facial expressions between various people as they're playing volleyball. I mean, really great. And at this point, again, the show has not reached the peak where it was popular. And I am waiting for the chance to it to actually be good, and I'm holding on to that hope. But anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. And once again, Happy Veterans Day, and I'll see you in the next one. And forever and always, I'm always here.